Hello, fellow literati, and welcome to In the Dark, the internet's most laid-back literature show. I'm Nikita, as per usual, and today we're going to be checking that you can hear me okay. I think that should be fine. Hello, hello. Today is the fourth part of a four-part answer to a question by Kratos223. Kratos. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. If you haven't seen the first three parts, check them out. They will be linked up there, and also down below for your enjoyment. This video will be about, so this is in response to the part of your question that said you're interested in, let's see, examples of some of the most basic works, and also a little bit of developing the literature background. But essentially this video will be about essential books, essential reading from the Western canon. It'll be 11 books, 11 classics, if you will, that you can start with. And they should give you a really good feel of kind of the tradition of Western literature, the history of Western literature, broadly speaking. After having read these books, you will at least have a general sense and the ability to speak, of course, assuming that you've kind of understood them and you've also taken a little bit of time to figure out why these books matter. But with these checked off, you'll be well on your way to, this is kind of like the starter kit. And full disclosure, I haven't read all of these books, so some of the summaries may be a little bit off. I think I have a good sense overall of what they're about. But yeah, so this isn't, mandatory reading. But I think if you were to ask for recommendations in terms of fundamentals, these are books that would be recommended, usually. Most of these, at least. Some of them are mine. They're my opinion. And also, a lot of this list overlaps with the Western Canon by Harold Bloom, which I mentioned in an earlier video, in one of the earlier videos of this four-part response. So, in terms of, if you want to have kind of a critical guide to explain why these books matter, that's a good place to go. I feel like that's probably the most succinct and authoritative explanation of what's important about these books. But I'll give you a gist here. Okay, and just before I start, again, reading these books just on their own might not even make a whole lot of sense to you. And I don't mean you specifically, I just mean you, the viewer, may, because some of these books are really, really old. So it's important to also figure out what about them is significant, kind of what has made them timeless classics, and why they're so influential, why they were so influential. Because some of these are like 2,000 years old and they're still relevant. So it's not so much just reading it that's important, but kind of getting a feel for the rationale and the impact that they've had. But of course, reading them will help you get illusions, because, like I said, kind of throughout the history of English literature, although not all of these are English, but throughout the history of kind of the Western canon, for lack of a better word, Western literature, as opposed to, of course, like Middle Eastern literature, Chinese literature, and so on. Throughout the history of Western literature, people have interacted with the subjects, the characters, and the techniques of these texts. Anyway, so that's why it's important to read them. And you can get by without it, but again, these are just essentials. That's the point. So the first one is the Iliad by Homer, a classic Greek epic. Has to do with war, the sack of Troy, I believe. I have not read this one, but it's very, very, very important, very significant. If you want to read any poetry that isn't like 20th century poetry, you probably want to know this, because like people reference it a lot of references to it. And the same with the second book in the list, the Odyssey, also by Homer. Wow, he's got 2 slam dunks. I play that off. Gracie's asleep. She will not be making a guest appearance, I believe, in this episode, nor eating, as her contract dictates. Anyway, so the Odyssey is kind of the sequel, if you will, to the Iliad. The events happen after that war from the Iliad. Also very important. Also, I have not read it, but hugely influential. Next up is the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. This is kind of like a Middle English text. It's a collection of stories, I believe, 26 stories. That's kind of, it satirizes the church and other things. Also have not read it, but it's very widely read. Chaucer is like, for that whole period of Middle English, between like the Greeks, between the Romans and, Shakespeare, or like just before Shakespeare, there's obviously a lot of, I'm sure, a lot of writing, but even I only know Chaucer, at least from what I recall. I'm not sure when, I think Donne was later, but Chaucer is like huge heavyweight. So even like I have a decent knowledge, I think, of at least who's important, and Chaucer is the only person I know from that period. So hugely influential, super important. Yeah, there you have it. Next up is the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. This one I have not read as well. I'm just outing myself. I'm a sued, guys. I don't know anything. He hasn't read any of the classics. What a waste, Ute. The Divine Comedy. You know what? I just realized that Paradise Lost isn't on this list. Shout out to Paradise Lost by Milton. John Milton. That one I've actually read part of, but not the whole thing. Anyway, the Divine Comedy is kind of like, I think it actually might be Dante himself as the main character, and he basically like descends into hell, going through all the circles of hell. So that's important. It has like religious stuff going on. I don't know like a whole lot about it. Next one is Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. This one I can tell you even less about. I think has something to do with like a journey. It's funny, I believe. But yeah, I haven't read a lot of the super like older classics, but these are I'll probably get to them eventually. They're worth reading. But yeah, you can look it up. You can judge yourself if you want to read it. But definitely an essential if you want to. I feel like it's hard to say that you have a strong grasp of kind of like the history of Western literature without these ones. But I do not claim to know such a thing. I know more about modern and contemporary, modern basically, so from the Enlightenment, which is kind of the period that we're coming up to now, with Hamlet by William Shakespeare. So Shakespeare, of course, probably like the most known, just literature guy. He's kind of like the Neil deGrasse Tyson of literature, except he's actually good and he knows what he's talking about, depending who you ask. But yeah, Hamlet I think is probably his most next level thing, perhaps his most influential as well. It's my favorite of the few that I've read, so if I had to recommend one, I would recommend Hamlet. It's William Shakespeare. I don't think I needed to explain. And moving on, we have Lyrical Ballads by William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge, which is a book of poetry with a super famous introduction by William Wordsworth, which is basically like the manifesto for Romanticism, which these two guys kind of started to a large extent and popularized. Some of their most famous poems, both Wordsworth and Coleridge, are in this book, including the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is one of, it was in yesterday's video of my favorite poems. But yeah, super influential book, basically kicked off Romanticism, which spawned Shelley, Keats, among others. And then obviously, just like a hugely influential movement beyond that. So beyond the other romantics, basically everyone since then has been to a certain extent influenced by them in one way or another. So really influential, worth checking out. Next up we have, can you guys hear me okay when I talk like this? I think so. I hope so. I'm having second thoughts because I feel like I'm losing my voice. I've been talking for like hours. And I'm not like talking, I'm sort of like semi-whispering, trying to enunciate, among other things. Anyway, next up we have War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy, of course, being pretty much the most famous and significant prose stylist in Russian. Kind of the Pushkin of prose, if you will. Pushkin is the most famous Russian poet. So Tolstoy, undeniably master of prose, master of realism. War and Peace is not a novel, according to him, which makes sense to me. It's kind of a lot bigger in scope than a novel, and it also has nonfiction components where it's sort of like philosophical and just kind of like intellectual meditations as well. But huge achievement. Almost undeniably the masterwork of realism. Widely considered his most impressive work. Yeah, and just a beautiful thing. It's a bit long, but whatever. um, it's cool. It's very interesting. Yeah. So next one is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. So, this is only 11 books, so Walt Whitman is not on this list, although he's super influential. But of all the Americans, I chose Mark Twain, and I think I would not be considered very crazy for doing so. The only real rival I would consider for this position would be Melville, Moby Dick. But I do think that The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn are kind of like a great, really unique, powerful, technically impressive, just basically an all-around, what was I saying? Oh yeah, like widely considered to be like the all-American novel. Really set the stage, set the tone for everything that came, I think, for probably the next 100 years after. It would be hard to find a writer that, an American writer, that wasn't in some way influenced by Huckleberry Finn, or by at least by Mark Twain. And Huckleberry Finn being his most impressive prose work, from what I understand. And again, I'm not a scholar of American literature or Mark Twain, but that's my rationale. Next up, Ulysses by James Joyce, which is a retelling. Well, hold on. Joyce is basically one of the most important modernists, and Ulysses, if I recall correctly, Nabokov, he's Nabokov anyway. Nabokov considered Ulysses to be the most important prose work of the 20th century, the most important novel, most important book. So James Joyce is kind of a modernist, experimental writer, to an extent. Not quite an avant-garde writer, so not that experimental, but really experimental for, I guess, what can be considered a mainstream writer, which may be unfair. Ulysses I have not read as well, so. But from what I understand, it's a retelling of the Odyssey, which we talked about just moments ago, by Homer. So it retells the Odyssey, basically, but it's set in Dublin in the 20th century. And it has a lot of really neat experimental effects, like technically speaking, stream of consciousness, which is modernist technique. So just all around super influential, and basically it's the Odyssey of the 20th century. So it was about as influential and impactful as the original Odyssey. And finally, how much time do we have? Wow, another 20-minute video. I hope you guys liked that. Hopefully this is interesting. I'm trying my best. If you're just disgusted, you're probably already not watching. But leave a comment below whether you are disgusted or not at this video length. Anyway, finally we have my boy. If on a Winter Night's a Traveler by Italo Calvino, my boy, who you may recognize from my favorite books. Invisible Cities was on my favorite books. But I would not say that Invisible Cities is nearly as significant as If on a Winter Night's a Traveler. which I have, interestingly enough, also not read. But I have it right here. It's on my to-read list shortly. But basically, the reason this is on the list, this is maybe a contentious claim. But I definitely think, I don't think it's been decided yet who the kind of the heavyweight juggernauts are in terms of like not poetry, in terms of books. I get the sense that there hasn't really been anyone that's very unanimous. I haven't heard a critical consensus about who matters for this period, but I will take a stab at it myself. So I think, the only name that I feel like really is fair to put with these people is Italo Calvino, just because he's a great writer, great storyteller, very powerful. But most importantly, I think of all the writers I've read, he best encapsulates kind of all the postmodern ideas. I mean, I guess like Pinkin, whatever his name is, he could maybe be here. And then you have like whatever, Don DeLillo, Cormac McCarthy. Sure, like there's other famous people, but I think in terms of essentials, you read Italo Calvino, you'll get a decent sense of what the second half of the 20th century was about, but not from a purely academic point of view, from an actual artistic point of view. So If on a Winter Night's a Traveler, it's basically a book. It's a book where you're the protagonist, and the book is about you reading the book. And then beyond that, it just has a bunch of different beginnings to the book that you're reading. Hey, it's meta. So that's what it's about, which is very cool. I'm excited to read it. And I would recommend it as well for you, just as kind of, I think maybe it's not quite on the level of Ulysses, but I think it's comparable to Ulysses in the sense that the techniques of that time period and the kind of the critical questions are being explored in it. So there you have it. These are 11 books, 11 classical books that I would recommend starting out with if you want to kind of get a sense of the really important stuff. There are a few important ones omitted. Again, if you want to see the full list of the Western canon, I recommend The Western Canon by Harold Bloom, which will have an expanded list that will not include Italo Calvino and probably not include Wordsworth and Coleridge either. Thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this extremely long-winded response, Kratos223. Hopefully that was helpful and addressed your question. If you have any more questions, I would be happy to answer them in another 4-part series. But yes, if anybody else has a question, please leave it below, and I will address it as soon as possible. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you next time, which is tomorrow, of course. See you then.